Welcome to a very special EWTN on-location bookmark from Washington, D.C., the studios of EWTN's News Nightly with Colleen, Carroll, Campbell. I'm Doug Keck, here with Colleen, Carroll, Campbell. Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
And it's really exciting, Colleen, to not only get to talk to you about your latest book, My Sister, the Saints, a spiritual memoir, and talk a little bit about some of your earlier work, but also talk a little bit about the program here in this wonderful new set as you've been previewing here in the month of September.
Right.
Now, let me ask you just a couple of questions. One of the books we recently did was, years ago, was called The New Faithful, and it recently aired. We re-aired it on EWTN. And I'm wondering, because in reading this wonderful book, which you call a spiritual memoir, which goes through your life, My Sisters, the Saints, you could see so much of your own journey. It really is like a 15-year plus journey this book is about. And you see how that connects to your earlier work as well, because I think it's in the third chapter or so you talk about that part when you actually went and did that particular book. Let me ask you, there's the New Faithful. That goes back to about 2002. Right. Now, does that make me the Old Faithful? And where are we in between now? And you were Generation X, but is it the millennials now?
Right.
And let me ask you, how is Generation X doing? Are they still faithful? And what about the group after them, the millennials? Any input?
Yeah, well, so when I researched The New Faithful, I was looking at Gen X and the beginning of, at that time we were calling them Gen Y, now millennials. So I did get some of that millennial perspective. Obviously, The New Faithful, not so new anymore.
Right.
Little, many of them.
You're holding up pretty well. I can tell you that.
Thanks.
So
I
that's
appreciate
okay.
that. Yeah. So, yeah, it was a phenomenal year for me personally to travel the country and interview more than 500 young Catholics and evangelicals. Mostly, there were some of other Christian traditions as well in that mix. And so I have kept in touch with them through the years. It's been interesting just to see how their lives have unfolded.
Like specific individuals you had spoken to?
Quite a lot of them.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
often they will reach out to me with updates, or I'll see some initiative they were talking about, you know, in the nascent stages when I interviewed them, and now that's, you know, mushroomed into a full-blown operation, and many of them are moving up the ladder in their various careers and doing a lot of the things they were talking about when they were, you know, in their early 20s being interviewed by me for this book. So it's inspiring. I've noticed with the Catholics especially, there's been, if anything, an increase of devotion, a deeper grounding in the faith. A lot of them, like any of us as life goes on, you know, they're embracing their marriage vocation, vocation to the priesthood or religious life, and they're getting to the point where they've been in those vocations long enough to get rooted in them and to have experienced struggles. And I really see a lot of persistence with this group. It's exciting. Also, a lot of the initiatives that they began that were really new in 2002 when I wrote The New Faithful have now kind of taken on a life of their own, and now we're seeing kids, you know, in college and coming out of college moving right into these
So there's
groups.
actually this follow-through effect, this ripple effect, maybe.
Exactly. In many ways, a lot of these folks laid the groundwork for the millennials who are now coming along, and when they're excited about their faith, there's somewhere to plug in part due to the work of many of these new faithful.
Well, there's like Focus, obviously, on campus, which
Exactly.
really has come along big time since the beginning of the...
Exactly, and
you know.
it was mentioned in there, but it's grown exponentially in the years since then. We've seen that kind of thing just on campuses across the country, even places where things were in a very early stage in terms of kids getting excited again about the faith. Now those have become, you know, hotbeds of devotion and orthodoxy. So there's a lot that's happening there. There have been some converts to Catholicism. And I've also kept up with some of other traditions. And
Now, how are they faring?
You know, it's a mix, like it is with anyone, but I would say some of the evangelicals I tracked have actually become Catholics. Some have remained in their traditions and again are kind of pursuing, whether it's in Hollywood or Capitol Hill, the objectives they had to bring Christ to those places. There's been a contingent of sort of that younger evangelical group that has drifted more toward the emerging church model. And you know, there are a lot of issues there, especially with moral relativism, and so that's a little bit more of a trend that's stronger now than when it was when I was writing The New Faithful. So there's been a little bit of a divergence there. Kind of the sort of unchurched model. So,
well, do you think it's also a function maybe because of the depth and the breadth of Catholicism, how deep it runs, the truth runs, that there's a well that sustains you, that maybe for some of the more evangelicals, they don't have quite as much that depth there, and maybe maybe a little emotionalism, and sometimes over periods of time, that can fade away.
I think it's true that, it's interesting, many who have even remained evangelical, they draw upon Catholic resources when they're making arguments for what they believe, or when they're trying to go a little deeper, especially into the contemplative aspect of their faith.
I think you actually talk about that in your new book. You actually talk about that.
Yeah,
right.
so I think that's absolutely true. And there is always this thing with youth and religion where it's a very emotion-driven experience, kind of the World Youth Day effect, and does that last? And I'm seeing, at least among the Catholics I've tracked, it does last, but it does also go through this purification period, and many of them have gone through that. The good news is, most of the folks I talk to are just as excited about the faith as ever, and now they're raising their children in the faith.
Right, and that's so important, that second generation, the Gen 2 there. And also, and in some ways, and you talk about it in that book and a little bit in your new book, is the idea that not only are the new faithful the laity, the new faithful also the priests, in many cases, right?
That's right, and those sort of baby priests, as they are often called now, are even maturing themselves and have been, in the priesthood maybe 10 years, or they're, of course, in the case of some of the Jesuits I profiled, they just got ordained, but longer formation. But yes, they too are maturing in their vocations and beginning to have a chance to be in positions of authority where they can affect the changes that they think will help the next generation not go through some of the catechetical wilderness that they did.
Right, exactly, because I think one of the great things about EWTN is it's a catechetical network, a teaching network.
Right.
And I think a lot of the churches come to realize, albeit a little late to the game sometimes, how the catechesis wasn't done, and you needed to have that inculcation of the faith.
Yeah, and that was the main complaint of at least the Catholic New Faithful, and that's a main focus of what they're doing going forward, whether it's with their parishioners or their own children.
Now, one of the things I know in an interview that was done several years ago with Ignatius Press, you talked about the rise of moral values post-2004 election. And I'm just wondering, do you still see that today? Because, I mean, obviously we've got some interesting things happening. It seems like on the pro-life side, the young people are with us. On some of the other social issues, gay marriage, things like that, not so much.
That's right. And that's, the main division. The values voters of 2004 obviously did not have the same impact in 2008 or 2012 in the elections. There is that strong contingent still out there, many of them, of course, EWTN viewers. But as you said, that divergence, especially when you look at the younger generation and especially at millennials, very much winning them on the abortion issue. They basically see abortion as mean, and that's why the pro-life side is winning. The same-sex marriage issue is much tougher because there, again, when judging things in terms of sloganeering, the slogan of equality is a lot more persuasive than a longer extended argument on, well, here's what happens when we start separating marriage from children and we start acting like it doesn't really matter if a child grows up in the same home as a mother and a father. And, there's not a catchy way to say that, and it's part of a context you have to give people to even understand the Catholic view of marriage and family, why it matters that God created us male and female. So I think this generation is hungry for that teaching, but it's not a catchy slogan, and I think that's one reason we're not doing as well on the same-sex marriage debate.
And I know in your book, My Sisters, the Saints, you talk about that, because obviously you're talking about the saints that you touch base with and read and kind of connect with, who are women, and a perspective on that and your own life journey. The other thing with that too, and I think what you said there is, in a sense, it seems like the younger people see, well, having an abortion, it's mean to the baby, but two people love each other, it's mean if they can't get married or have that relationship. And
they're not hurting anybody. And the person we don't think about when we say that are the children. Because it's not just the children in those particular homes that are not growing up with a mother or not growing up with a father. It's all the children affected by the fact that marriage is, slowly and subtly destabilized when we have a situation where we no longer connect lifetime commitment to having anything to do with our maleness and femaleness, to the fact that it is important that society encourage men and women who come together to stay together as the parents of their children. And once we start saying marriage is about romantic feelings only, or it's about whoever I want to connect with, it's not about this permanent bond that in most cases leads to children, then we start divorcing those two ideas. And it's not a quick thing that we can see, but over time it becomes a situation. I think the fear is, and I think we've seen some data from Europe, that marriage in general just comes to be seen as less necessary. If it's just about how I feel, then why does it matter whether we even bother getting married, and why does it matter, who marries whom, and it's all rooted back in that, for us, that understanding that God made us male and female for a reason, and the differences are important and they matter, and so marriage has to reflect that, and it matters that children grow up in a home where they're exposed to both the gifts that a woman can bring them and the gifts that a man can bring them. And that's something we've kind of lost.
Right, and also I think because the loss of the sense of history, that, they always talk about the fact that nobody gets history anymore. Well, one of the things you learn from history is the mistakes of the past. And if you look at countries and empires and civilizations that played fast and loose with marriage, it didn't end well.
That's right, and children are usually the first to suffer. So when we say there are no victims here, everybody wins if anybody can marry anyone they want, and if we just redefine marriage to make everyone feel more included, who we're forgetting are children who deserve to grow up whenever possible. It's not always possible, but whenever possible, with their biological mother and father. And by saying marriage isn't about that anymore, we're discouraging couples from going down that road, and we see that in the rising rates of everything from cohabitation to, out of wedlock births, where now, it's coming close to half the population. So again, it's not always possible, but that should be our ideal, and we've kind of lost sight of that.
And unfortunately, you have to say it that way, because otherwise you're assuming that people will say that you're being hard on this poor woman, that she's doing the best she can. And this whole idea that everything is the hard case. Let's not talk about the general situation. Let's talk about this one hard case, which will show how you're heartless for believing what you believe. And it's not a good idea to make law that way or anything else, to understand that there's nothing wrong with telling somebody that it's better to be like this. We understand it might be like that. But, to say this isn't better and just say that it's okay is problematic, and that's what we see.
And there are arguments to be made simply, on a rational basis, that there's a public purpose to marriage, and the purpose wasn't to ratify our private romantic feelings. The purpose was social stability. Down through the ages, 5,000 years, human beings have recognized it's not a good idea when there's no stability, when mothers and fathers are coming and going off the scene and kids don't know who's going to be raised with whom. It's just a good idea to have marriage for that purpose. That's why we give tax breaks to married people. Not enough, but we do. So all of that, yeah. So I think it is important to point out this isn't always possible, especially as pro-life Christians who recognize it's a heroic choice often that a single mother makes to stand up and have that child, and she's doing the best she can, and we're not here to kick her because she doesn't have a wedding ring on her finger. But that doesn't mean that marriage isn't important, that fathers aren't important. And a lot of also what gets lost in this is the importance of fathers. Like they're just kind of second-rate moms, and if you don't have one around, what's the difference? Well,
really
ask a child who grows up without one. Again, it's not always possible to have one in the home, but ask a child who grew up without a father, and even as President Obama has said, yeah, it matters. It really matters.
But we also live in an environment now where, to some degree, the state has replaced the family, and certainly in some cases the father, as being the breadwinner in the family, and that has also been, and men, unfortunately, and you talk about it in kind of the feminine revolution a little bit, we ended up in a situation where instead of kind of raising men up to maybe act better like women, we decided to lower women down to act like men.
Well, men at their worst,
and their worst, right? Exactly, that kind of situation. Let me ask you something on that, because you mentioned stability. That was one of the points you made in your book, The New Faithful, that's what the New Faithful are looking for too, like stability, orthodoxy, something they could base their lives on, right?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And that's why I think the Catholics in this cohort have fared especially well, because they do have this 2,000-year-old tradition, and they're drawing on philosophers and theologians and saints from down through the centuries, and they have this central figure, the Holy Father, even today. And you can pick up a catechism if you want to know what the Church teaches. Not enough Catholics do, maybe, in terms of putting their own spin on things. But I mean, there's a lot to sink your teeth into if you're ready to get serious in your commitment to your faith. And I think that's always been attractive to this group, especially because so many of them grew up where things were so confused,
In
they
flux,
really didn't know.
Right, yeah, exactly. And that's the case. Many times people just didn't know what the truth was, or they believed what they were being told, and they acted, based on some bad information at times. And not necessarily because people were malicious, but they were misinformed as well. Well, one of the things, too, you mentioned in New Faithful, and you related earlier about these young people take their faith and not just go and hang out at the church, so to speak, or the youth group forever, but go and take it into the media, like yourself, or into other jobs, politics, etc. The question is, how is that faring for those people? Can somebody do that and hold on to their faith? And let me ask you, that whole idea of how things are spun, isn't that some of what this show is about?
Well, I think that is very much what News Nightly is about. That is the challenge, and that was the challenge even for these kids when they were in college in their early 20s. I think all the more so once you're raising kids, and it's a question of, what do I let my kids be exposed to? Who do I let them hang around with? I mean, all of this, we're to be in this world, but not of it, and that's the constant challenge for a Christian, is how do I bring the light of Christ to places where it's not there, or at least not burning brightly enough, and at the same time don't expose my own soul, or especially the innocence of my children, to forces that are going to overwhelm us and sort of put out that light of faith. So it's a constant balance, and that was the main struggle for the New Faithful then. Probably as you grow older, perseverance becomes that main struggle, but either way, it's always that question of, I want to answer God's call to go out into the world, and at the same time, I need to preserve the gift that He's given me and my family.
Right, and as you said, you need a touchstone, whether it's the Holy Father, the Magisterium, the Catechism. Hopefully for some people, in a lot of ways, EWTN has become that. It's not the church, but it tries to reflect the teachings of the church. And certainly this program as well, at least the goal is the truth. That the truth is what's coming out, the story reported honestly, and certainly the idea of presenting, let's say, the Catholic perspective that many times, not to slant the story, but many times is just left out, or because the story is really slanted against the Catholic perspective, right?
That's right. I think with a show like this one, with this show, I think the big gift that we can offer to viewers is context. We're all inundated with information. You can go on the internet any hour of the day and find out the latest on everything. I think what we can offer at EWTN News Nightly is a way of putting that in context and connecting that to our Catholic faith. So, there's this debate on the budget or on immigration. How do I think about that as a Catholic? And sometimes there's not one answer. It's not black and white. The Catholic position is X. I mean, on abortion, pretty clear. On something like the budget, not clear. There are a lot of perspectives, and we want this to be a show where those perspectives are heard and legitimate debates are aired. But we also want it to be one where voices that you don't hear elsewhere are heard. And so even just on our debut program, talking about the HHS mandate that would require religious employers to cover drugs that they have moral opposition to.
We know that at EWTN, that's
exactly,
for sure,
and
right.
EWTN is part of the lawsuit against that. But just to know that there's this whole cohort of women that are rising up to speak out against this, and you don't hear their voices too often in the mainstream media. You don't see their faces, and you're just told that women are uniformly in support of this, when in fact a Gallup poll from about a year or so ago showed that American women were about split half and half. So that's the kind of thing we want to bring out. We're not so much trying to be the very first with a story. We're trying to be the ones who help you understand the story you've already heard from a few different angles you might not have heard.
And maybe follow up on some of the stories that have relevancy to our audience that kind of drop off the radar screen maybe too quickly, like the Gosnell story was, et cetera, or something
exactly.
like that.
That's something I would hope we would, had we been on the air at that point, be really taking a close and hard look at, in the sense of just bringing updates and also bringing commentators on. I mean, a whole lot of this it's really a news analysis program, and a whole lot of it will be hearing from the best and brightest Catholics to help us understand how we should be thinking about these things and what we can do about them. So often I think folks at home just feel like Washington is this insane place, and how do I ever impact anything? But sometimes it's your local involvement that matters the most, and that's the kind of reminder.
Subsidiarity, as the church would say.
Exactly.
Right? Right.
So we also want to equip people so they have the information they need to make a difference in their own communities and around the water cooler and in conversations at the back fence. I mean, that's how people's minds are changed on everything from the life issues to the value of marriage and family.
Right, and exactly. And the media as well. We know about the gay marriage, and many times there was the comment that was made about Will and Grace. I think that maybe Vice President Biden said, well, we all understand now. And I noticed that you wrote an article a couple of years ago, when there was a documentary the HBO did on Gloria Steinem. And I thought it was interesting, the idea of here you have somebody, and you pointed out in the story, being presented as this perfect icon and everything's wonderful in just one perspective. And that's what people, young people many times, see and don't get the other side of the story, right?
I think that's right. I mean, in the case of the feminist movement, it's a complicated one. And Pope John Paul II, I'm stealing that line straight from him. He said the legacy was a complicated one. But, on the whole, he saw it as a development that moved us forward. But he also saw some serious drawbacks, the main one being the disregard for unborn human life. And as I talk about in My Sisters the Saints, I'm not an anti-feminist. I recognize I probably wouldn't even be here were it not for some of the advances of the women's movement. But we've got to stop thinking about women and children as their welfare as sort of a zero-sum game. And I can only win if there's no rights for an unborn child, or if my own children have to suffer. It's not me versus men or me versus children. Women don't gain when others lose, And so an authentic women's movement, I think, is what Pope John Paul II called it when he called himself a feminist pope and said, I believe in a lot of the messages of this movement, but what we've got to do is remember that a woman finds her total fulfillment in self-gift, in love, in generosity, not in rejecting life, not in discounting the rights of others. And so there are a lot of different type of feminisms, and I'm one who hasn't given up on the word or the movement, but I recognize there's some huge flaws, at least from a Catholic perspective.
Right, and because in many times it connotes a whole series of positions that so it becomes a negative expression. A lot of times you'll hear a pro-life feminist to be as a clarification of where someone's coming from, so someone understands. Yeah, let's talk about in the closing minutes, and we were lucky we're going to have another program to talk about this book, My Sisters the Saints. Now, this is the second book you wrote then?
That's right. So it was The New Faithful and then this one.
Okay.
Yes.
Now this came out just recently, right?
Yes.
Like about a year or so ago?
Just in the end of 2012, so it's not very old.
Okay, so about a year ago. And the other one was what, 2002, 2003?
Yeah, so it took me about 10 years
so
to get
is
out
the next
my
book coming out in another 10 years? Or,
at the rate, I'm going with this show, I'm going to be pretty busy probably to be writing another book, but yeah.
Well, that's the question. What was the impetus to do after that amount of time to write this book? My impression was this was something that was percolating for a while.
It was. I began working on it in 2006, and it took a lot of different iterations before it finally became My Sisters the Saints, and before it became a spiritual memoir. I didn't set out to write a memoir. I'm trained as a journalist. I know the importance of keeping yourself out of the story, so this was a very counterintuitive move for me to open up so personally about my own journey and my own struggles and my own faults. And I did that only because every other way I kept trying to write this and communicate the truths that had changed my life, I realized I was trying to do it while not saying why those truths impacted me and how they changed me and how they kind of became real to me. And the way that happened was with my friendships with these 6 women saints whom I profile in My Sisters the Saints. So in the end, for me, it wasn't a list of doctrine that changed my life. It was primarily, of course, an encounter with Jesus Christ via his church, but also, more specifically, an encounter with some of these women saints to whom I could relate at pivotal points in my life where I said, wow, that's a woman who knows what it's like to stand in my shoes and deal with this kind of issue. And she turned to Christ in that, and she, navigated that situation with grace and wisdom that, frankly, I don't see in a lot of secular role models. I want to read more about her and learn more about her. And so these women saints literally changed my life. And in the end, I felt there was no way to talk about that change without talking about where it began, which was my own journey and these women saints.
Right. It's very honest, and we're going to hear more about it next week as we continue our discussion on My Sisters the Saints with Colleen Carroll Campbell. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back next week here on location from Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Keck, EWTN's Bookmark, and of course this is on the set of the beautiful EWTN News Nightly program with Colleen Carroll Campbell. Stay with us. Join us next week.